This is the INKPULP podcast. This is the INKPULP podcast. Comics, hip hop, life. Welcome to the INKPULP podcasts. I'm your host, Sean Crystal. This podcast is going to launch a series of maybe, I think I got notes over here. If I look over here, I got notes. 6 episodes, it looks like. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. We'll see how it goes. And it's about how to break into comics. I know there's a lot of people out there that want to do comics and would love some inside tips like I did when I was trying to break in. So the first thing I want to do is kind of tell my story. Excuse me, it's allergy season. Because when I wanted to do comics, it wasn't easy to get into it, but I did. And there's a bunch of different ways you can go about it. I'm just going to tell you my story first, and then I'll cover like everything from early childhood on through high school with artistic development. We'll talk about art school or no art school. We'll talk about the different industries that comics kind of incorporate. And this is all under the umbrella of INKPULP Instruction, which is my art education business that teaches you or anyone how to be a better artist and a better comic book artist. And that link is in the description, inkpulpinstruction.com. I've got 4 episodes out when this comes out. Check them out. There's a free lesson for you waiting. There's a free lesson waiting for you. If you go to the website, sign up for my newsletter, you'll get a free lesson. So, my story. I didn't always want to do comics. I was a little kid, and I would wake up. I've told this story before, so I don't want to go too deep into it, but I'd wake up very excited on Saturday mornings because the Spider-Man cartoon was on, and I wanted to do that. Like, that cartoon was everything. I loved seeing who the villain was that week. I loved everything about it. I loved Spider-Man, and that sort of launched me into a path of pursuing animation because that's what I knew. I hadn't really seen a comic book yet, and I grew up thinking I was going to get into animation, and I was a big fan of Disney and TV animation and loved cartoons, and always had a cartoony bend to my art. And then when hip hop came out, when it came out, like when it entered my life, we're talking mid 80s. Early 80s, and I got into graffiti. That also influenced me. And when I got into skateboarding, the graphics and that whole lifestyle influenced me. So all of that kind of congealed me into the artist that I am. So when I was about 15, someone handed me a comic book. It was The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. And that book blew my mind. I didn't know comics could be so grown up, if you will, so mature, so risque. I thought they were all very safe, kind of fluffy superhero stories, but this one kind of shook me and said, whoa, I should check this out, this medium. And I dug into Frank Miller, and at the time, Todd McFarlane was drawing Spider-Man. I loved that artwork, and I dug into that. And around that time, I also saw a movie, Brian De Palma's The Untouchables, which made me see for the first time what visual storytelling was, how choices that a director makes. You know what? The clouds keep popping in and out. Let me just shine a little light on me. Oh, there you go, Shawnee. That movie, I saw choices the director was making that were affecting how I was responding to what I was seeing, and that's when I discovered what visual storytelling was. And that's when I realized my drawings, because I was into animation, but you're just part of a cog in a machine, and there's no individuality in the voice, and I really wanted to use my voice as an individual. And seeing that, I was like, oh, so comics are a combination of drawing and movies, and seeing how Frank Miller did his work, and David Mazzucchelli with Frank Miller, and that movie The Untouchables really sunk in. Like, this is my calling, this is what I want to do. And I was 15 at the time. So when it came time to apply to college, at this point there was no college programs in comic book art, I wanted to be a comic book artist, and I didn't really want to study animation, so I thought illustration was the way to go. I didn't know anything. I mean, conventions existed, but they were really tiny little things. And most of them weren't like industry. They were just selling old comic books and toys and stuff. So I went through my undergrad studying illustration, think, okay, when I get out, I'll have a degree, and then I can get a job at Marvel or at DC. And I learned after I got out of college that it's a freelance business, and you don't apply for jobs. You kind of got to get noticed. So around that time, I saw a commercial for San Diego Comic-Con on Sci-Fi Network, and it said something about portfolio reviews. And at the time, I had reconnected with an old friend who was trying to break in too, and we were like, let's go. Like, let's do this. And so I went. It was like maybe a year after I graduated, I went. And that's where I got my first portfolio review, and that's where I learned. Like, I had just drawn pictures next to each other, flashy looking stuff, fun looking stuff, but no real understanding of how storytelling works. And luckily there's a Dark Horse editor named Randy Stradley who sat down with me and said, I see something in here that I really like, but you really don't know what you're doing. So he gave me a reading list, and it was Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, Will Eisner's Sequential Art, Comics and Sequential Art was the Will Eisner book. And it might have just been those two, actually, now that I think about it. So I went back and I read them, and I was like, oh shit, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. So that's when I dove in, and I was like, I need to start going to conventions, I need to start seeing editors on the regular, and I need to be doing what's called sample pages constantly, and getting feedback and taking the feedback and then implementing that into my work and showing the editor that gave me that feedback, I listened to you, I've changed what you suggested, I'm working on the areas you said were weak, and I want to get them better. And so I did that for years. Started going to every convention, networked my ass off. I met everyone, and was in favor with a lot of publishers, but wasn't really getting work yet. And during that time, I went to grad school to study. I found out there was actually a program in comics at SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design, and they had a master's program. And I knew I had a knack for teaching, and I knew that with a master's degree, you could get a job teaching on the college level, teaching art, and thought, like, hey, that would be actually a decent way to make a living while I'm trying to get my comics career off the ground. And so while in school, I still maintained going to conventions, and I went to a convention that ended up giving me my first job while I was a student at SCAD. And that's a funny story into itself, which I've told on this podcast, but just a quick recap. I met an artist I really liked there named Lee Bermejo. I met an editor. Lee Bermejo was at Wildstorm at the time. I met an editor there named John Lehman. John Lehman was an editor at Wildstorm at the time. And they saw my work and they liked it. They took my sample packet. I mean, this is like, email was young at this time. There was no like JPEGs being emailed around. You made Xeroxes and you made little packets of your work with your contact info on each page and you handed that out. So they took it back to San Diego with them. And Lee was working on a book, a Resident Evil adaptation. Not an adaptation, a Resident Evil comic. And Lee was working on it, and I think around this time they offered him Gen 13 Superman, and of course he jumped at that and quit Resident Evil, which left a hole for an artist in that book, and that editor probably wasn't too happy, but was like, well, Lee, who am I going to get to do this? And Lee was like, actually, boom, this kid. And he handed him my portfolio. And then later that day, that same editor, whose name was Jeff Marriott, said to John Lehman, who I met in Orlando, I really need an artist for this book that kind of gels with what Lee was doing, because Lee had started it. And John was like, oh, check out this kid. Boom, handed him my portfolio. So in the same day, he got 2 packets of mine. And this is what the hustle does. Like, I just was hustling, and it worked. And so that editor called me, said, apparently you're someone I need to know, because I've had 2 people recommend you to me for this. So ended up trying out for the gig, got the gig, and that was my first job, and that was with DC Comics at Wildstorm. And finished that while I was in grad school, got out of grad school, and didn't get another follow-up job in comic for 10 years. My second job was 10 years later. That was a hard time, but that taught me a lot of valuable lessons, and I wanted to relay to you that getting in is one thing, staying in is another thing. It's a tough industry in a lot of ways, but nowadays, and I'm going to get into this in a later episode. Nowadays, it's so much easier to get your stuff out there than when I was. I mean, you've got the internet now, which really helps. So I did get into teaching, and I ended up building the comics program at SCAD when they opened their Atlanta campus with my friend Pat Quinn, and ended up teaching there, building that department. Pat eventually went up to be a dean, and I was there alone and hired faculty under me and built that department and taught there for 10 years. And 5 years in is when Marvel called me. So there was a good 5-year period where I was working for Marvel Comics full-time, teaching and running the sequential art department at SCAD Atlanta full-time, and I had a family. Shit was real, but the hustle's real. So that's generally my backstory, and I want to tell you that because I want you to trust the information I give you as we move forward, and I tell you how to break in or different ways to break in. So I did break in, and once that happened, and for 5 years I was teaching and drawing comics, I left teaching because comics got so busy, and that's when I landed a Batman gig at DC Comics. And that's kind of my story. So I want you all to know it is a tough living, but it's all on you. It's great in that it's all on you, but it's also hard that it's all on you. So I'm going to talk about strategies along the way of things you can do. What I have found that works for me, or I'm hoping that works for me, is to create streams of revenue, that passive revenue that allow me to draw. And INKPULP Instruction is one of those. So I've got others like my TeePublic merch site. I've got projects I'm working on with the Farside. Hello, Farside Network. Farside TV, I mean. So, anyways, lots of stuff going on. I'm figuring out, but that's kind of my story. So please come with me every week for the next 5 more weeks. I think it is. I think so. And let me tell you my thoughts on breaking into comics, what to think about, what to do, and all that jazz. I think this is a necessary tool out there, and I don't think there's a lot of these out there. spoken by people who have run the gauntlet like I have. So thanks for listening. I'll see you next week and we'll get deeper into it. Peace. This is the INKPULP podcast. This is the INKPULP podcast. Comics, hip hop, life.